and welcome to your Construction Safety Association Manitoba's 2025 Safety and Health Week virtual webinar series. Safety and Health Week is an annual occupational health and safety celebration. Safety and Health Week focuses on the importance of preventing injury and illness in the workplace and raises understanding and awareness of safety and health issues. My name is Megan Story, and I am the Training Development Manager of the Construction Safety Association Manitoba. We are proud to be recognized as your premier and trusted source for safety and health information, resources, training, and core certification. Today's virtual webinar is an example of how we are striving to provide you with a practical and relevant information to help with accident prevention in your workplace. For those of you who know CSAM, quite simply our answer is yes. How can we help? We will have the answers to your safety questions, or we will find the answer with the help of other qualified resources and partners in safety and health. Today, I am pleased to introduce Dana Bergman. In today's webinar, Dana will explore the often overlooked link between culture and safety and how recognizing those hidden connections can help you build a more inclusive and safer workplace. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and a copy of Dana's presentation will be made available. So at this point, Dana, I will pass off everything on to you. So just bear with me as I do that transition.
Great. Thanks, Megan. I will go ahead and share my presentation and we will work to make sure that everybody can see it.
Looking good on my end, Dana.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm super glad to be in the room with you today. It's my privilege to have worked with Megan on a number of different projects in the past couple of years. And I think this is a great conversation and a great way to start with introducing the importance of cultural competence and what it is that we need to know in order to ensure that people are safe. And so in the next little bit, we're going to be talking about how do these two things connect to each other, which is a really important and interesting conversation because we sometimes overlook what's really going on, or maybe don't recognize some of the signs that we might be looking for when we think about what's the connection between cultural competence or working across cultures, and how does that connect to safety in the workplace. Before we jump in, a couple of quick notes for you. The content for today is based on my own learning and working with newcomers, along with work at Regional Connections Immigrant Services, and building resources through the Pembina Valley Local Immigration Partnership, which is the resource arm of the organization. And so much of the content comes from work that's already been done and is reflective of what's happening here in Manitoba around newcomer experience. As we get started, I would like to do a short activity. And so if you are at your desk, what I'd love for you to do is I'd like you to pick up your pen or pencil, and I want you to write your name. So you can print it or write it in cursive, whatever makes sense for you. I'll just give you a moment to do that. And for those of you who may be comfortable, I want this to be a classroom experience. And so feel free to turn on your video if you're comfortable doing that so that we can see each other. And we can have this conversation in the next hour. So hopefully you've taken a moment and you've just somewhere on a corner of a paper or a Post-it note, you've written your name. Now what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to put your pen or pencil in your other hand. And I want you to write or print your name again. Give that a try. Tell me how it works. I am monitoring the chat, and so I want to know kind of what your experience is. How did that feel? You can tell me orally by unmuting your microphone, or you can drop your feedback in the chat. How does it feel when you have to move the pencil or the pen from your dominant hand to your non-dominant hand? What happens? That's a great description, Jason. Love it. Someone else? How are you doing? It feels awkward. It's not legible. Yeah, it's hard to read or understand. Sure, absolutely. Anyone else? It feels awkward. Certainly. Foreign. Did anybody find that transition relatively smooth? You kind of thought, okay, well, this isn't so bad. It's difficult. Yeah, for most of us, it is. And really, in order to get this conversation started today, I want to talk about the idea that when we address cultural competence or thinking about being culturally appropriate or managing cultural conversations in the workplace, It can be all of these things. It can be awkward, it can be difficult, it can feel really foreign or uncomfortable for us. Sometimes some people will say it's just not even possible. Like I just can't do it. I can't move the pencil from one hand to the other. And there may be somebody in the virtual room today that is thinking, you know what, why are this was no problem. I transitioned from one hand to the other and it was no big deal. And that's also what these conversations are like. And so as we go through the next, 45 or 50 minutes together, you use your left hand. Well, that's great. So then you have to move it to your non-dominant hand, move it to the right hand and tell me what happened then. Thanks, Adam. A great observation. Yeah, and so this idea that depending on how we experience this conversation in the next little while, some of us are going to walk away going, well, that wasn't that big a deal. I don't know why we're having this conversation. And some of us are going to go, that was really awkward or uncomfortable for me. And that felt was really difficult. And I had never considered that. And so what's my responsibility in this? And so this conversation is tricky. And that's why we do this little demonstration just to start, is because it's tricky. And having this conversation is really important because almost everybody that I talk to cares about and wants other people to feel safe and comfortable in the workplace. And I believe them. I want that too. I want to feel like that. I want my kids to feel like that. I want the people that I work with to feel like that. But at times, we still struggle with others across cultures because even when we have good intent, it's not always experienced that way by others. And so today is really about reflecting not on our intent, because I believe that we're coming into the room with the right intent, but it's on our behavior and the messages that we may be sending that we're not. And so we're going to work through the presentation. I'm going to ask you to interact with me a couple of times as we go through the next little bit. We're going to try and save our question and answer period for the end of the session, and I'll do my best to answer your questions and also give you some additional contact information. So if you want to reach out, I'm happy to have additional or further conversations. So welcome to today. It's May 7th, Cultural Competence and Workplace Safety. What are the hidden connections? What might we be missing when we think about what our role is? And in a conversation about diversity and inclusion, in thinking about how that connects with safety, it's appropriate for me to offer a land acknowledgement. What you see on the screen is a picture from my home. I'm from a rural area outside of Winnipeg, and I am grateful for the land and the water where I live. And so as I strive to understand the historic and ongoing relationship between colonialism and the land where I live, I respectfully acknowledge that I live, work, and learn on Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. As I mentioned, I'm grateful for the land and the water. I'm working to learn more so that I might support partnerships with individuals and communities, Indigenous nations, in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration as a way to support equity and justice. I care about that very deeply. And I further acknowledge that I do not always fully understand how to do this work. And so I'm learning and unlearning to try and fulfill this calling. So what are we going to do for the next little bit? For the next little bit, we want to talk about what's the connection between cultural competence and safety. We're going to be taking a look at sort of what are the things that might distract somebody in the workplace that can influence their experience at work. And then a little bit later on, we're going to talk about what are some of the direct impacts in the workplace where safety becomes at risk. And we're going to talk about bias. What is the impact of bias on distracted workers? And what are some of the red flags that we should be aware of? What are some of the things that we could be looking for that might influence how people experience this? Or what might be happening in the workplace. And then the tool that I'm going to give you today is called the Something's Up Reflective Learning Cycle. And it helps us to stop and reflect on what's happening when something feels odd or off or awkward, so that we might consider what's our role in connecting intercultural competence and safety. When something's up, when it seems odd, what can we do, or what should we be looking for? Or what should we be thinking about when we're thinking about what's happening from a cultural context perspective? Okay, so here is our next activity. Are you ready? I have a challenging situation for you. You're in a car that's moving at a constant speed. To your left is a steep downward slope. To your right, a large fire truck moves at the same speed as yours. Directly ahead of you is a helicopter flying less than 2 feet off the ground. You can't seem to get around it. Suddenly, you notice a rider on a large horse behind your car. He's keeping pace and seems alarmingly close. How will you get out of this situation without hurting yourself or someone else? And so rather than sending you into small groups, I think what I'll do is I'll just give you a minute to think about it and feel free to put your ideas into the chat. What do you think? What's the solution? How can we get out of this without hurting ourselves or anybody else? Are you stuck? Are you thinking? What are your ideas? Okay, Trevor says slow down, maintain speed, use cruise control. Okay, signal the rider that maybe that you're slowing down by tapping your brakes. Okay, so good solutions. So using cruise control, that just means we have to sort of maintain this like forever and ever into eternity so that nobody ever gets hurt. Is that kind of the goal? Hazard lights, we could try that. Yep. How are we gonna, what other ideas do you have? Slow down, pull over to the right by signaling so the person behind sees what you're doing. Okay, so all of it is about warning somebody or providing some aspect of warning or notification to others. If the horse rear ends you, they're at fault, MPI says. So it's good to know. It's good to know the legislation around that. I'm not sure that that mitigates safety at all, but a really good point for us to know. So I'm going to share the answer with you. And really, how are you going to get out of this situation? Carefully step off the carousel and run back to your mom. And somebody out there is going, oh, yeah. And so the truth is, I set you up. And this exercise is going to make sense pretty soon. But what makes this difficult is that an important piece of information was missing. And that causes us to make assumptions. Yeah, slope it to the right in the photo. Absolutely. There's another option. And so one of the things that we wanted to be talking about is what's happening or what am I missing? What assumptions might I be making that are influencing somebody else's experience? And particularly when it comes to culture. And so using that information, um, let's take a look at a second scenario that where we know already that something must be going on. So we have a strange situation, and this is scenario number 2. You're going out for dinner alone in Winnipeg, a city that you're visiting for the first time. The server offers the soup of the day, and you say, that sounds very good. They bring you the soup, and you laugh. After you have finished the main course and ask for the check, the server brings it, together with 4 sweets. You wonder, why are they so rude? You pay and get ready to leave. The server gives you a hostile stare. You're convinced that they hate you. What's going on? Clearly, something is happening. And so just like in the previous scenario, where there were assumptions that were underlying because we were missing key information, in this particular scenario, we're missing some key information. And so if I were to go back to this scenario and say, imagine that you're a Japanese visitor visiting Winnipeg for the first time. You go out for dinner alone in Winnipeg, a city that you've never visited before, and the server offers you the soup of the day, and you say, that sounds very good. They bring you the soup and you laugh. What just happened? Well, in Japan, it's very customary to not decline or say no to somebody. And so rather than saying, no, you didn't want this soup, you said, that sounds very good, which the server then interpreted as they want the soup. And so they bring you the soup. And then as the Japanese person, you laugh, which is a form of a way to cover up embarrassment in Japan. And so we've got an interaction here where people aren't really understanding each other. After you finish the main course and ask for the check, the server brings it together with 4 sweets, and you wonder why they're so rude. So in Canada, it's pretty normal or customary or typical for us to get some sort of a candy when we are finished our meal. It's pretty common that that happens. Um, and so if somebody were to bring me four sweets, I'd go, this is awesome. I got four sweets. It's just me, one for my mouth and three for my purse, and I'm ready to go. In Japan, uh, four, the word for four is very similar to the word for death. And in Japan, you would only give somebody four of something if you would wish them harm, if they were an enemy. And so when the server brings the four sweets, the Japanese person wonders why, what they've done to sort of earn um, this desire to inflict harm, why they would send this unwritten message. So then you're finally finished your meal, you've worked through some of these things that are going on, you pay and get ready to leave, and the server gives you a hostile stare, and you're convinced that they hate you. And so what's happening here? Well, in Japan, it's not customary to tip, which is pretty customary in North America. It's a very North American custom. Not all countries, not all cultures have a mechanism where you would tip a server or a worker or somebody who's providing a service. It's pretty typical in North America when the service is good that a tip is provided at a meal, particularly at a restaurant. And so, again, we have a discrepancy in our communication. And so that's really frustrating because even when we both walk into the situation with the right intent, because we don't have a good understanding of each other's culture, we have a bad experience. We walk away, and neither the server nor the Japanese tourist had a good experience when they came to visit Winnipeg. And is it because either of them intended harm or looked for opportunities to create a bad experience? No, it's because we didn't understand each other. And so, thinking about some of the implications of looking at our behaviors rather than our intent is really about taking a look at how do we navigate these cross-cultural situations so that we understand people's experience a little bit better. So, what do we know about diversity? Well, most of us will know that diversity is that broad range of characteristics that's covered by human rights, things like gender and sexual orientation and race and religion and color and a host of other characteristics that identify the things that essentially make us different or that we notice about each other that are different. Usually they're surface things, but sometimes diversity is invisible. Sometimes it's visible. But what it does is it challenges our view of what's typical or normal for us. I grew up in an environment where everybody pretty much looked the same. And so having somebody who looked different than me was was different as I got older. And even as I moved away, different schools had different dynamics. And so we start to notice some of these physical things. But diversity is not just visible, some of it is invisible or invisible. And why is this an important topic for discussion? Because it's easy to make assumptions about what we observe, even if it's not a physical characteristic. Communication theory says that we tend to believe what we see over what we hear. And so, what we see, whether it's gestures or facial expressions or fabrics or food or how people celebrate, are those things that we tend to see and understand about diversity, but may not help us understand all of the facets of diversity. The risk of not understanding diversity is that we look at, we need to consider both the personal and the business case for challenging our own perceptions. And that's because if we don't get it right, if we don't understand that intent is not enough and that behaviors are the expressions that people experience and they believe what they see over what they hear or what we tell them, then there's an emotional impact. There's an emotional impact, there's potentially a physical impact, a financial impact. And as an organization, there is also a reputational impact. And so when we think about as an organization, if we have people that are leaving because we don't have a good sense that our intent and our behaviors meet, or that that's their experience, then we start to impact that starts to impact our organization's reputation. And how do we then become that employer of choice? How do people want to work with us or work for us? Just like in the scenarios that I offered, we make assumptions about what we see, hear, observe, visualize, and often we don't even realize that we carry biases that influence how we interpret everything, that interpret how we see our world or how we experience our relationships. And so I just had somebody who shared in the chat that perception trumps intent 100% of the time. And you're right. And so, many organizations that I talk to have great vision, mission, and values. They have excellent defined intent in how they want to run their business, and yet still struggle on a cultural level and struggle with safety because people's perception of how life works there, how work happens, how things get done is maybe different than what the intent is. And so it's this idea of how do we make sure that those two things coexist appropriately. Interestingly, I took this picture that you see on the screen, and you can see that there is a power bar with a bunch of cords, and it's connected to this light up octopus. I took this picture when we were on holidays about a year and a half ago. We got to go to a Central American country for holidays, and I took this because I thought this was a really interesting safety picture. And it just shows you again a little bit about the difference in safety culture, because it's pretty normal where we were. Even if it rains, they don't take this apart or take it in. And this would not be standard behavior in Canada. And so understanding, even when we bring people in and we're dealing and working with newcomers, they will have their cultural experience and their life experience that contributes to what's happening in the workplace. But we're going to have to teach them, and we're going to have to explain what and why. And so a good example of what does diversity look like when it connects to safety. So what is bias? Well, there are two kinds of bias. There is conscious bias and unconscious bias. Bias tends to be or is our inclination for or against something, which is typically in a way considered to be unfair. It can involve both favorable and unfavorable beliefs or attitudes about a group that determines how we perceive or behave with that group. If we believe that one group is, more frugal than another, then we might say that, they have a really strong sense of financial or fiscal responsibility. And we think that that's valuable. Whereas we might look at somebody else who has a bit of a different perspective on spending, and we will make a judgment based on them or their group associated with that. We may have a perspective around work ethic. And what does work ethic look like? And in the Pembina Valley, in the Red River Valley, in Manitoba, we are very deadline driven because we have seasons. And so that sometimes influences how we view work ethic across cultures where people are coming from places where they don't have the same type of deadlines that we do in Manitoba. We have a 90-day growing season here, and we have a shorter construction season than a lot of other countries do. And so those things influence our schedule, they influence our timelines, our structure, our deadlines, they influence our labor laws with regard to how construction works throughout the best seasons for building and developing roadways. And so when we have people who come who don't have the same work ethic as we do, we tend to look at that and find it wanting and find that it doesn't connect to. And so we're going to talk about it in a little bit about what does it mean for people to be the right fit. And so we often look at somebody who doesn't have a similar work ethic or a similar work experience as not being a good fit. And so we're going to explore that in a little bit. Conscious bias can be easily observed. Unconscious bias can't necessarily be easily observed. But in both cases, there are times when bias presents itself in the form of what we call microaggressions. And so some of the ways that we experience microaggressions are by the language that we use. And so I'm not sure if you're familiar with some of these sayings, but you can feel free to give me a thumbs up or something like that, or in the chat. In Canada, a thumbs up means yes, I agree, or good job, or right on. But it doesn't mean the same thing in every country. Was anybody familiar with any of these idioms, which are rooted in bias and oppression? We're going to explore each one of them really briefly, but have you heard any of these sayings before? Yes. Great. Thanks, Maggie. Appreciate that. Yes. Okay. Three of four. Yes. Thanks, Jason, for the thumbs up. You bet. Not the first one. Okay, great. So we're going to go through each of these. And so just as a quick note, the first one is right seat on the bus. And so this idiom phrase was actually taken and used by Jim Collins in a business book called Good to Great. And he reframed this idea that as an organization, we want to make sure that people are in the roles that are most suitable for them, that leverage their strengths, and those kinds of things. The original saying comes back or goes back to the civil rights movement in the US. You may recall the story of Rosa Parks, who was required to sit at the back of a bus because that was a section for Black folks, and decided one day that she wasn't going to do that anymore. And she sat at the front of the bus and ended up getting arrested because of that civil disobedience that she did to protest the segregation between Black and white societies in the US. And so it goes back to that. And so we want to be careful because when we think about the right seat on the bus, how are we using it? How are we using it? Because the original intention behind that saying is to make sure that everybody has the right seat on the bus was really rooted in discrimination and racism. Going the extra mile. Most people are familiar with this. Early in the first millennium, Rome had a law that anyone 12 years or older could carry a soldier's gear for an entire mile if they were asked by a soldier. It was in light of the law that Jesus of Nazareth reframed it and taught the principle of going the extra mile, doing something that you don't have to do. But the original law was rooted in racism and oppression. And many societies will look at this as a positive, but not every society, not every culture recognizes the value or contributes to or engages with the New Testament and the Bible and understands sort of where that law comes from. Some societies recognize that law as rooted in the original oppressive tendency that happened as part of the law that Roman culture made over occupied lands early in the first millennium. And so we can use it. We just want to be careful how we're using it. Because we want to make sure that what we're not doing is sending this perception of oppression or of oppressing other people. To get gypped. Many people have heard that. It means to get ripped off, cheated, or swindled. The phrase comes from demeaning the word gypsy, which is often used to describe the Romani people. The saying perpetuates an unfounded stereotype that Romani people are untrustworthy thieves. In reality, the Romani people have been discriminated against for more than 1,500 years. What could we say instead? We could say to get ripped off or to get cheated instead of saying to be gypped. And then, of course, the last one is no comments from the peanut gallery. And so this one's pretty common too. I've even mentioned this one and said this one to my kids, called them the peanut gallery. Since learning about the root of this idiom, I have started to rephrase how I use it. And so the peanut gallery refers to people who give unsolicited advice or a rowdy group of people in the cheap seats in a theater or a stadium. The term comes from the vaudeville era of the late 1800s and refers to the parts of the theater that were specifically designated for Black people in the segregated US. The peanuts part came from the reality that peanuts were often the cheapest food available for purchase, and some hecklers would throw their peanuts at performers they didn't like. The negative connotation of the peanut gallery is rooted in racism against Black Americans who occupied those seats in the back of the theater. So what could we say instead? Instead, we could say no comments from the hecklers. Examining our language and speech is really important to ensure that we support positive relationships. I have a TED Talk here by Valerie Alexander, and the link will be provided in the resources that you're sent after this workshop. But I do want to share just 2 minutes of this video with you because she talks about how do we outsmart our own unconscious bias. So when things might be happening that we're not recognizing, that are challenging how we look at our view of the world, or should be challenging maybe how do we adjust our view of the world. There's some really good tips in here that Valerie has. And so I'm going to get the video started. Give me just a moment. I'm going to mute myself so that there's no feedback. And I'm also going to, I think there's probably going to be a commercial right at the front because it's a YouTube video. And I'm going to just transition to the 2 minutes that we want to be watching.
How do you change the unexpected to the expected? Well, there are 3 things you can try. 1, as you go about your day, visualize situations before they happen. The meeting you're about to walk into, the new doctor you're seeing, the driver you just pulled over for having a broken taillight. And whatever mental picture you get, change it. Open yourself to different possibilities. The second thing, when we do encounter the unexpected, have the courage to examine your own behavior. Ask yourself, is this how I would handle this interaction if this person looked like me? Or if this person didn't look like me? Third, make a conscious effort to expose yourself and your children and others to that which is currently unexpected and doesn't need to be. Hire the employees, patronize the businesses, vote for the candidates who have earned the position and are also challenging the norms. There are enormous and long-ranging consequences when we can change the unexpected to the expected. Consider this. We have 2 entire generations in the world whose first visual image of a United States president is Black. It doesn't matter what kind of hate or ugliness might have been spoken in their homes, that picture is always within the realm of the expected for them. We normalize things by making them expected.
Okay, so just 2 minutes of that. And so she has some really great tips here for when we are experiencing bias, or maybe experiencing bias, or maybe even we're not recognizing that we're experiencing bias. How do we challenge ourselves to flip it? How do we flip it to test it? And so we consciously can change the unexpected to the expected. You know, all of us have these ideas of what a doctor looks like, or what a surgeon looks like, or what a taxi driver looks like, or what does somebody working in construction look like, or somebody who's, an executive assistant. We all have a picture in our mind of what those look like. And so how do we challenge our own assumptions to make sure that we're not being overcome with bias? And so the 3 things that we can do is visualize those situations before they happen, change our mental picture, examine our own behavior, and then look for opportunities to normalize what might not be expected. And so how do we do that? Like, what's a tool that we can use to accomplish that? And so I want to introduce this Something's Up reflective learning cycle, which has been really helpful for me as I have worked in different industries or with different industries and across leadership, as we try and figure out how do we connect, or how do we make sure that we're not missing something. And so the Something's Up reflective learning cycle helps us to stop and suspend judgment. before we start to make sense of what's really happening here. So if something feels awkward or uncomfortable, or we might say our spidey sense is tingling, right? We've got this feeling that something odd is going on. What can we do in order to address that? And so the key identifications in this reflective learning cycle are that we tend to interpret and make judgments about individuals and cultures in 3 stages. We observe, we interpret, and then we evaluate. Interpretation and evaluation are by default according to my cultural norms, or according to your cultural norms, or our organization's cultural norms. But if we really want to know an individual, we need to observe them longer. So we need to spend more time in observation, and we need to do it from their first culture. So in the case of the server and the Japanese tourist, in that case, if either one of them would have started to ask a few more questions or ask about what's customary in their culture, they may have both walked away with a better experience. How can we learn about somebody else's culture? Because many of the things that we think and that we believe influence and are things that we've been taught since we were infants, since we were toddlers. And so if we want to care, if we want to demonstrate that we care across cultures, we need to interpret and evaluate based on somebody else's first culture, not on ours. And that can really change the way that we look at things. It can also give us more opportunities for good performance management conversations, for good training conversations. And also by observing and learning, we'll not only be more accurate in our interpretation and fair in our evaluation, we'll be able to help advise and counsel newcomers as they learn to adjust to local cultural norms. And so the content that we're going through today isn't just for CSAM's group, it's for everybody. The conversation changes depending on who's in the room, but we can have the same conversation with newcomers. If something feels odd or interesting or is unusual or doesn't feel normal or typical or even feels bad or uncomfortable or awkward, just like moving our pen from one hand to the other, we can stop and we can try and observe from the organizational culture or Canadian culture. The key with integration and cross-cultural communication is to suspend interpretation and evaluation to allow more time for observation. Quick judgments are based on our own cultural norms, and that's how our brains are wired. We're wired to make shortcut decisions based on historical knowledge and survival. And so how do we slow that process down? Because when we make those snap judgments, they are prone to error when we're working across cultures. So what questions do I have? And what assumptions am I making? Those are really the 2 questions that are the heart of critical thinking. And so what are some of the areas where we might see red flags at work? The first one is when somebody says, I'm not sure that they're a good fit. If somebody has that conversation with me, the first question that I would ask is, what else might be going on that would lead you to believe that they're not a good fit? Because sometimes there's a cultural implication. And if that's the first thing that I go to is that they're not a good fit, then I need to start asking some other questions about why. And so what are some red flags? So if people don't speak up in meetings, there may be a cultural influence. Maybe they're not allowed to. Lots of Southeast Asian cultures come from a very hierarchical structure, and working in meetings or collaboration is really not a process that is done. There are some where you take direction from your supervisor and manager, and that's what you do. And you don't complain, you don't say no, even if you don't know how. You do the best you can and you figure it out. And that can lead to safety implications, that can lead to training implications. But if people don't speak up, people who don't make eye contact, it's very typical in North American culture for us to look around and say, if somebody doesn't make eye contact with me, then they're avoiding me, or maybe they're lying, or they don't care. Again, Middle Eastern cultures, some Filipino culture, even Indigenous cultures in Canada have a very different view of making eye contact, and that making eye contact is a significant sign of disrespect for elders or for people who are in leadership roles. And so if you're sitting in an office and having a workplace performance management conversation and somebody refuses to look you in the eye, one of the, bias red flags is when we immediately jump to this person is disrespecting me, because it may not have anything to do with disrespect. It may have everything to do with doing their best to be respectful. And so working across cultures, if there's something looks or feels or seems off, how do we use that reflective learning cycle to stop and evaluate what's really going on? What might I be missing? Other red flags, if people don't take initiative. Some organizations want their people to take initiative, but a lot of people are coming into the workplace and are feeling unsure because they're not quite sure how to do that in an appropriate way, or maybe culturally it wasn't valued where they came from. People who are too direct or blunt, or sometimes take too long to respond. People who are too emotional or not emotional enough. People who didn't sell themselves in an interview. Maybe people are late or casual about time, and that's where our discussion around work ethic and how we manage timelines and deadlines. If they don't engage in small talk, or maybe they don't fit our leadership style. There may be a whole bunch of things that could be happening that influence how we see whether or not somebody is a good fit for our organization. And so what's our role? Well, the truth is that we can be both victims and perpetrators of unconscious bias at the same time. I can be someone who experiences bias as a woman in leadership. It's been part of my story. I can also demonstrate bias to other people in leadership, or to people who are working, or to young workers. And so I can be both a victim and a perpetrator of bias at the same time. I can be both an advocate for women leaders in business and struggle with perceptions of women in leadership if I don't feel that I'm being represented well. Many of us can come up with examples where we have been experienced bias, where we have also unconsciously inflicted that bias on someone else. And so after today, take a little bit of time to consider, where are some areas where you may have made decisions based on unconscious bias? When you looked at a resume, did you immediately discount somebody because you couldn't pronounce their name? Did you immediately discount someone because their experience or education was not from Canada or North America, or even from this province? Did you discount somebody because they were from a rural background, or because they were from a urban background? There's so many ways that we can challenge our own perceptions and our own assumptions. And so the things that I should be thinking about when I engage with colleagues or with clients or with prospective candidates for employment is, what are some of the things that might be causing me to look at this in an unfair way? Unconscious bias isn't about good or bad people. It's about our automatic patterns of thinking that affect us. And recognizing this dual role can help us to foster humility in our own processes and openness to learning about the things that we might be missing. Some questions for you to reflect on and think about. And these will be part of the information that you get after the workshop as well. But how have you encountered unconscious bias or lack of diversity or inequality in the workplace? How was it handled? Was it handled appropriately? What suggestions are you going to do or offer to try and improve the place where you work? And how does this impact how you support your clients and your colleagues? A couple of suggestions for action. What are some things that we can do to try and ensure that we're mitigating bias as much as possible? We can create some standard processes to reduce bias. We can replace our gut reaction with some deliberate action. We can become more self-aware of our own unconscious biases. I'm very well aware of some of them. And so those biases that I know, I'm sure that I still have unconscious biases that need to be addressed. What's my messaging? How am I communicating around how my team thinks, how I think, how my organization thinks about diversity and difference. Is it overly optimistic? Is it tokenized? Do I have a realistic perspective of this? What barriers do we have? How are we making it harder for somebody to be successful, or even for us to find the right candidates? What are some hot button issues, and how can we examine our own behavior? And so I have one example here that I'm going to share, and it's a family related example. I have a daughter who graduated in civil engineering technology with her architectural engineering specialty. And so she is a drafting design specialist, and she works for an organization that builds custom homes. And I know that when she was looking for jobs, and she was looking for drafting techs or drafting specialists, she would look for jobs that had those specific words in there. If it said draftsman in there, then she would consider carefully whether or not she was ready to apply to that organization, simply because of the language and the terminology that was used. And so, as part of reviewing standard processes in an organization, it's important to review your position titles. I come from a manufacturing background, and a lot of the jobs that were in the manufacturing location where I worked had man at the end. And so instead of becoming a pressman, we changed it to press operator. And so how do you make sure that you embrace diversity? Some of it is just as simple as changing the way that your position titles are advertised, to invite a greater diversity in terms of response when you're looking for work. In terms of developing cultural competence, this spectrum is a simple way for us to think about what's the journey that we want to take when we're thinking about how do we become more aware. We start with cultural awareness, and this is, most of us are already at this place where we acknowledge difference. We don't necessarily understand the context, and it doesn't necessarily require that we change our behavior. As we move toward cultural sensitivity, we start to see different ways that the world can be observed, and we start to integrate some of those changes in our practices or our behaviors, kind of like changing our job position titles so that we can ensure that when we're advertising that we have a greater candidate selection coming in simply because of how we've turned them. Cultural competency. This is where we start to show increased respect across cultures and values across broader diversity, more than just gender diversity. And this is part of where we start to see this representation of action on the part of an individual or an organization. The goal really isn't that we stop here. It's not really at cultural competency. The goal is that we continue on with the journey and that we move to this idea of cultural humility, where we have a lifelong commitment to evaluating and thinking about what else could we be doing, and what should we be doing? And do we have have we considered both the moral side as well as the business side, and the business case? And so understanding sort of how we've done that, we've talked quite a bit about the personal case, but what's the connection to the business case? Like, why would we care about this from an organizational standpoint, from a financial standpoint, from a safety standpoint? Well, there are several impact areas that influence or are influenced by whether or not somebody feels safe in the workplace or whether they're experiencing safety. For someone who is regularly and consistently having to deal with microaggressions or having to try and understand how to integrate themselves into the workplace culture, whether it's organizational culture or safety culture, that becomes a big part of the thinking process and the stress that's associated with everyday life. And so what's happening is that cultural competence has a profound impact on the sense of belonging that an individual will have in a workplace. When those things are missing, these are a few areas where we might identify or see the impacts of workers who are distracted by factors that cause psychological stress. You might see a decrease in productivity. or quality. Your communication and collaboration go down. Your employee engagement and job satisfaction also go down, and your opportunities and innovation go down. At the same time, you increase your risk of errors, you increase your safety risks, workplace conflict, as well as turnover and burnout go up. And this is important because as of recently, WCB is accepting psychological injuries as valid claims and recognizing the link between mental and emotional stress and physical safety in the workplace. Work and life are not two separate things. The struggles that people have around communication, around relating to others culturally, influence each other, whether they happen at work or whether they happen outside of work. And if people experience bias and discrimination at work, and they experience bias and discrimination in the community, that has a profound impact on our sense of wellness overall. And most of us who work full-time spend more time at work than we do with our families. Therefore, work has a very profound impact on somebody's life experience and their work experience. There could be other impacts that you would notice in the workplace. Things like people are spending a lot of time in the bathroom, or maybe they have a lot of doctor's appointments, or maybe they're away for illness, or maybe there are other things that you're noticing. But people who are struggling to understand how to integrate and how to feel safe in the community are really impacted by the psychological impact of what's happening when we don't feel culturally safe in an organization, regardless of what that difference is. So how can we set ourselves up to do things differently? Well, hopefully I've given you a couple of tools or things to think about. But we need to, if we're not prepared, if we haven't thought about this before, this is something that we can think about in advance. How can we mentally reset, identify our biases, address those biases? And how can we, or how can you help your organization to be distinguished as a company or an organization of choice where people want to work? And that's really part of the question is, will people want to work with you, and why will they want to work with you? Word of mouth is still very powerful. Manitoba, Winnipeg, smaller communities outside of Winnipeg, word gets around. We're all connected. And even our largest industries are not that large. And we become the representative of what does our industry look like? And so how can we influence change is really what it looks like. And again, navigating this process for some is easy, or they've been on this journey for a while. For others, they haven't considered this journey, and it feels just like shifting that pen or pencil from one hand to the other. It feels awkward and uncomfortable to start thinking about what's the disconnect between our intent and our behavior, and what are people really seeing when they work together with us. That's all I have for you today. I'm happy to try and take a few questions. It's 12:55. We have 5 minutes before our session or our time is over together today. I want to thank you so much for your participation in the chat and just sending me the message that you're engaged and listening. And I wish you all the best. Please feel free to reach out to Megan or myself if you have questions, and we're happy to answer them. So we did just have something come up in the chat. So Erin says, I understand that employers have responsibilities to try and integrate and include everyone, but what about employee responsibilities? If a company offers tools, training, resources, meets and greets, and the employee consistently refuses, does WCB, for example, take that into account? So a good question. I'm not, I think Megan and CSAM might have a better answer for you. I would say that in my understanding, yes. So WCB's responsibility is generally to advocate for an employee. However, I would say that one of the things that organizations can do is they can make some of these tools, training, resources mandatory as part of the orientation or onboarding process. And so having that conversation and being willing to have an open conversation with employees so that they can help you adapt and so that we can make sure that you have a good employee experience is one of the best ways to go. And then not necessarily to always have that right at the beginning of employment. So some organizations will do, first day orientation. They will have maybe even some pre-employment stuff that an organization can do that you have to go through before you even get there on day one. Day one consists of hiring and benefit forms and TD1s and that kind of thing. And then some organizations will follow up with an extended orientation a few weeks later. There's so much going on in those first couple of days that it can be hard for new employees to grasp everything. And so coming back and reviewing it might be some options. But an employer can make some of those trainings and opportunities mandatory as part of the employment process. And that can help to mitigate that lack of contact or that lack of interest. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Yeah, so also having day workshops. So somebody messaged me and said, having a team day workshop. And so, that's another good opportunity, looking for ways to set some time aside. You might even be able to have these conversations at your toolbox talks or tailgate talks or huddles, whatever your organization calls them. Thanks, Deb. I appreciate that very much. I'm glad that there was lots of useful information. The goal is to walk away with a sense, not so much that we're doing everything wrong, but that what can we do to try and make our experience better too? Because when we do that and we try to bridge across cultures, it helps us to want to be at work. It helps us to want to have a good experience. And so ultimately, again, I fully believe that the intent that we all have is that people will have a good employee experience with our organizations. And so what can we do to support that? Any other thoughts or questions coming in? Please feel free to send them. Okay, Megan, I think I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Dana. Thank you for this wonderful presentation, and thank you to everyone who has joined in this afternoon for our lunch and learn. Very much appreciated, and thank you for the engagement in the chat and the questions and comments and working along with Dana in her presentation. I just wanted to share with you, obviously there was some connection with psychological injuries, and we definitely are aware of that happening in workplaces in Manitoba. And because of that, we actually are planning a session tomorrow, actually, with WCB, who will be speaking specifically on understanding psychological injuries and a guide to WCB legislation. So if it is possible for you to join in, please do. There is a QR code on the screen in front of you. If you haven't already registered, please do, and then you will receive a link this afternoon to join in for tomorrow's Lunch and Learn. As well as I just wanted to also highlight that we are always looking for ways to improve. And so if there is something that you would like to hear and see or have us do, we would very much appreciate your feedback. And so I'm going to go and scroll through to our QR code here. That's just a quick survey. If you could take a time to scan that QR code and give us your feedback on today's session and future sessions, we would very much appreciate that. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your interest in our speakers and our presentations. And thanks again to Dana for this great session. Otherwise, if I don't see you tomorrow on our screen, then I will see you around. Take care.